Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I used to work as a night custodian for a small town historical museum. You wouldn't believe the weird things you find cleaning old places, shadows in corners that feel too dark, creaks in the floors where no one's walking. But this happened one night, and it still chills me to the bone. The museum was housed in what used to be the town's old courthouse, built in the late 1800 seconds. It was a grand, imposing building with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and that faint, musty smell of age. My job was to clean the exhibit halls and offices after hours, alone. That night started like any other. I plugged in my headphones, grabbed my mop bucket, and set to work on the upstairs gallery. The exhibits up there were a mishmash of old photographs, artifacts from the pioneer days, and, my least favorite, an old judge's bench and witness stand, complete with a life-size mannequin and period clothing. I had just finished mopping the gallery floor and was gathering my supplies when I noticed something strange. The mannequin's head was turned. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt, but I was sure it hadn't been like that earlier. I chalked it up to my imagination and moved on. An hour later, I was downstairs vacuuming the main lobby when I heard a loud thud upstairs. My heart jumped. The museum was locked, and I was the only one with a key. I turned off the vacuum and listened. Silence, probably just something falling over, I muttered, trying to convince myself. I went upstairs to check it out, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The mannequin was no longer behind the judge's bench. It was standing in the middle of the room. My stomach dropped. I told myself someone must have been playing a prank, maybe a coworker, but as I approached it, I noticed something even worse. Its hands. They were different. The mannequin was supposed to be holding a gavel in one hand, but now both hands were clenched into fists, and they looked real. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my mop bucket, and sprinted for the stairs. As I reached the top step, I felt a cold gust of air brush past me like someone running by. I turned and pointed my flashlight back into the gallery. The mannequin wasn't there anymore. I bolted downstairs, grabbed my bag, and ran out the front door. I didn't even lock up. The museum director called me the next morning, furious about the unlocked doors and my abandoned cleaning supplies. I didn't care. I quit on the spot. A week later, a friend who still worked there sent me a text. Apparently, some school kids on a tour had pointed out faint, reddish stains on the mannequin's hands. They looked like dry blood. After I quit, I tried to put the museum out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't tell many people about what happened. Those I did tell brushed it off as stress, a prank, or even a dream. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew better. A few months passed, and I started to sleep better. Then, out of nowhere, I got another text from my friend who still worked at the museum. It was a photo of a crumpled piece of paper. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as I zoomed in, I realized it was a torn page from an old guest ledger. Scribbled in spidery handwriting across the faded lines was one sentence: "Get him back." I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. I called my friend immediately, but they didn't pick up. It wasn't like them not to answer, especially after sending something so cryptic. I tried again, still nothing. 2 days later, I got another text, this one just as eerie. It was a blurry photo of the mannequin, but this time, it wasn't in the museum. It looked like it was standing in a shadowy hallway. My blood ran cold. I recognized that hallway. It was in my apartment building. I didn't even think. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen and started checking every room in my place, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. I checked the locks on my windows and doors. They were secure. Still, I barely slept that night. The next day, I decided to visit the museum. I didn't want to, but I needed answers. When I got there, I found the place closed. The director, pale and visibly shaken, was talking to police outside. I approached cautiously, and before I could say anything, the director blurted, "It's gone." "What's gone?" I asked, dreading the answer. "The mannequin," she said, her voice trembling. "It's just gone." I didn't tell her about the photo I received. I didn't tell anyone. I just left. I knew I wasn't safe, and I knew it wasn't over. That night, I woke up to a loud knocking at my door. It wasn't the kind of knock that comes from someone politely asking to come in. It was frantic, pounding, almost violent. I froze in bed, gripping the knife I'd started keeping under my pillow. The knocking stopped, and then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through my living room. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard the door open. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. I stayed as still as possible, my breath shallow and silent. The footsteps moved closer and closer until they they stopped just outside my bedroom door. I gripped the knife tighter, ready to fight, but then I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, a faint creaking, like the bending of wood. Slowly, I turned my head to the door and I saw it. A shadow, tall, distorted, and unmistakably inhuman, stretched under the crack of my door. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, my neighbors were banging on my door, asking if I was okay. The shadow was gone. The police were called, but they didn't find anything. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. I moved out the next day. Moving out gave me some peace, but it didn't last. Even in a new apartment, miles from the museum, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. At first, it was subtle, things being slightly out of place, a strange creak in the floorboards when I was sure I hadn't moved. Then, the dream started, and every dream, I was back in the museum. The mannequin was there, but it wasn't behind the judge's bench. It was closer. Sometimes it was in the gallery, sometimes in the stairwell, always staring at me with those lifeless eyes and clenched fists. In the dreams, I couldn't move. I could only watch as it crept closer, inch by inch, until its wooden hand reached out to touch me. I always woke up before it did, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. One night, though, I didn't wake up in time, and in the dream, its hand gripped my arm, hard and ice cold. When I finally jolted awake, my arm was burning with pain. I turned on the light and saw it, a faint bruise shaped like long, spindly fingers. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. I knew it wasn't just a dream. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe I had developed some sort of sleep disorder, or maybe the stress from the museum had finally broken me. I even saw a therapist, but they couldn't explain the bruises or the eerie feelings that followed me everywhere. Then one night, something happened that left no room for doubt. I had just gotten home from work and was settling into bed when I heard a noise from my closet. It was faint, like a soft rustling, but unmistakable. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. Then, the closet door creaked open, just an inch. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stared at the sliver of darkness that now loomed in the room. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, and I saw it. Standing in the back of my closet was the mannequin. Its head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, but its face wasn't blank anymore. Its features were faint, like they had been crudely carved into the wood. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were deep, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. Before I could scream, the closet door slammed shut, shaking the walls. I bolted out of my apartment and didn't look back. I drove to a friend's house and stayed there for the night, refusing to go back alone. The next day, I called the museum director. I didn't care if she thought I was crazy. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced anything like this. When she answered, her voice was shaky. "You're not the first," she said after a long pause. "The mannequin, it's been part of the museum since before I started working here. We don't know where it came from, but every time someone moves it, something happens." "What do you mean, something happens?" I demanded. She hesitated, then said, "The last custodian, he quit too. Same kind of things you're describing. And before him, the guy who helped with the exhibit had a breakdown. Said he couldn't sleep because he kept saying it in his house." I hung up without saying another word. I didn't need to hear any more. I packed my things and moved again, this time across the country. For a while, things were better. I started to feel normal again, but every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a tall, shadowy figure just beyond the edge of the light. And every time, I feel that same cold gust of air, like a whisper against my skin. To this day, I keep every closet door locked. I never leave my curtains open at night, and I never, ever let myself think about what would happen if it found me again. This happened about 6 years ago when I was in college. I used to pick up odd jobs to make extra money, and one of the gigs I found was through a temp agency. They sent me to this enormous warehouse on the outskirts of town to help with inventory for a few nights. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well for a college kid, so I didn't think twice about accepting. The warehouse was strange. It was part of a much larger facility that appeared mostly abandoned, except for a small section that was still in use. When I arrived on my first night, the place was eerily quiet, lit only by buzzing fluorescent lights that seemed to flicker just enough to unnerve me. The manager, a gruff man named Steve, barely said 2 words to me other than to point me to the section I'd be working in. "Don't wander," he added sternly, as if he was issuing a warning. I laughed it off, assuming he was just trying to keep me from slacking. My task was simple: count in log boxes in a specific aisle. I was working alone, and the warehouse was massive. The further you walked, the darker it got, like the lights were either broken or not turned on for those sections anymore. I figured I'd just stay in my lane, literally, and finished my shift. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the hum of the ventilation system, but then it got louder. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but they were uneven, like someone limping or dragging something heavy. I stopped what I was doing and listened, but the sound faded quickly. I told myself it was just Steve moving around and went back to work. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and this time, it was accompanied by a faint metallic scraping. It sounded like someone was dragging a piece of metal across the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. No response. I tried to shake it off and keep working, but my nerves were shot. The scraping continued intermittently, sometimes seeming far away, sometimes uncomfortably close. At one point, I was so on edge that I decided to check it out. Big mistake. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the sound. It led me deeper into the warehouse, past the aisles I was assigned to, and into a part of the building that wasn't lit at all. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of rusted machinery, stacks of pallets, and empty shelving. The sound was louder now, and as I rounded a corner, I froze. In the beam of my flashlight was a figure. He was hunched over, wearing what looked like a filthy jumpsuit. Its back was to me, and it appeared to be dragging a long, metal pipe across the floor. The figure stopped moving the moment my light hit it, like it sensed me. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. I'll never forget its face, or rather, the lack of one. The face was obscured by some kind of mask or sack, with crudely cut eye holes that didn't seem to align properly. It tilted its head, as if curious, then took a step toward me. I ran, and I dropped my flashlight and bolted back toward the lit part of the warehouse, the sound of the draggy metal pipe growing louder behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the manager's office, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Steve looked up from his desk, startled. "What the hell's wrong with you?" I tried to explain, but I was barely coherent. He just sighed and grabbed a flashlight of his own. "Stay here," he said, and headed out. I waited, shaking, for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. Steve came back, his expression unreadable. "There's no one out there," he said flatly. "You're imagining things." I quit that job on the spot. As I left, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The bottom of Steve's boots were caked in dust and grime, the kind you'd only get from walking in the unused parts of the warehouse. After quitting on the spot, I expected Steve to argue with me, maybe even try to stop me from leaving. But he didn't. He just watched as I walked out the door, his expression blank and unreadable. The whole encounter left me with a heavy sense of unease. When I got to my car, I realized I was still shaking. My hands trembled as I started the engine and drove away, constantly glancing in my rearview mirror. The warehouse quickly disappeared in the distance, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole way home. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the filthy jumpsuit, the crooked eye holes in its mask, the sound of the metal pipe scraping the floor. I tried to tell myself it was some kind of prank, or maybe even my imagination playing tricks on me in that creepy old building. But something about Steve's reaction didn't sit right with me. Why was he so calm about it? Why didn't he seem surprised? The next morning, I decided to do some digging. The warehouse wasn't far from campus, and a quick internet search turned up a handful of articles about the facility. Most of them were old, dated from the early 2000s, but one caught my attention, a piece about the closure of the warehouse after a workplace accident. According to the article, a worker had been crushed by a faulty piece of equipment in one of the unused sections of the building. His name wasn't mentioned, but the article stated that the incident had led to a lawsuit, which the company quietly settled. The family of the victim accused the company of negligence, claiming they'd ignored safety protocols and left dangerous machinery in disrepair. The story gave me chills. Could the figure I saw have been some kind of ghost? Or maybe a deranged squatter who'd taken up residence in the abandoned parts of the warehouse? I wasn't sure which explanation scared me more. I tried to put it behind me, but the unease lingered. A week later, I got a call from the temp agency. They asked if I'd be willing to return to the warehouse for another shift. I immediately said no, but I couldn't resist asking if they'd heard anything unusual about the place. The woman on the other end of the line paused before answering. "We've had a few complaints," she admitted. "Some workers reported hearing strange noises, seeing things, but it's an old building, you know, probably just rats or structural noises." Her tone was dismissive, but I could tell she didn't entirely believe what she was saying. I thanked her and hung up, but her words stuck with me. If multiple people had experienced something strange, it wasn't just my imagination. The final straw came a few months later. I was walking home from class late one evening when I heard it again, the sound of metal scraping against concrete. At first, I thought it was construction work or a dumpster being moved, but then I froze. The rhythm was exactly the same as what I'd heard in the warehouse. I turned around, my heart heart pounding, and scanned the empty street behind me. There was nothing there, no movement, no sign of anyone, but the sound persisted, faint and distant, as if it was following me. I didn't run this time. I forced myself to walk calmly the rest of the way home, locking every door and window behind me. I haven't heard the sound since, but I still think about that night. Life moved on, and I did my best to forget about the warehouse and the unnerving experiences that came with it. I graduated, found a decent job, and settled into a routine. For a while, I thought I'd successfully put it behind me, but every now and then I'd hear something, a scraping sound at a parking garage, the metallic clang of a loose piece of machinery, and my chest would tighten, my stomach knotting with that old fear. About a year ago, I moved to a new city for work. It was far enough away that I thought I'd left everything about that part of my life behind, but then something happened that brought it all rushing back. It started innocently enough. I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, trying to make the place feel like home. My unit is on the top floor of a 4-story building with a view overlooking the street below. I've always liked living high up, less chance of anyone sneaking around, right? One night, a few weeks after I moved in, I was up late working on a project for work. It was past midnight, and the city had gone quiet outside. I was sitting at my desk when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal on concrete. I froze. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, or maybe someone moving furniture in another unit. But deep down, I knew better. The sound was too familiar, too specific. I got up and went to the window, peering out onto the street below. It was empty, except for a single streetlight casting a weak glow on the pavement. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing moved. After a few minutes, I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to my desk. The next night, it happened again. This time, the sound was louder, and it seemed to be coming from inside the building. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the hallway. The building was quiet, too quiet. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear, but the sound had stopped. I walked down the hall, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing. When I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and went straight to bed, hoping sleep would erase the unease gnawing at me. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining that figure from the warehouse, the mask, the draggy pipe. Over the next few weeks, the sound came and went at random. Sometimes it was faint and distant, like it was coming from another floor. Other times, it was so close that I could swear it was right outside my door. I started losing sleep, jumping at every little noise. I even considered moving again, but the lease had just started, and I couldn't afford to break it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of scraping directly outside my bedroom window. I live on the 4th floor. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The blinds were closed, but I could see the faint outline of something pressed against the glass. It was a hand. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver as I tried not to make a sound. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but those few minutes felt like an eternity. I stayed frozen, staring at the window until I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. When the police arrived, they found no sign of anyone. No handprints on the glass, no evidence of someone climbing up the side of the building. But the officers didn't leave me empty-handed. As they were leaving, one of them mentioned that I wasn't the first person in the area to report something strange. A few weeks earlier, a man in a neighboring building had complained about hearing scraping sounds outside his door late at night. When he finally opened the door, he found nothing but a long, rusted pipe lying across the threshold. I don't know if I'll ever escape this thing, or if it's even a thing that can be escaped. All I know is that it followed me once, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. It was Halloween night, and I was home alone handing out candy. My neighborhood is the kind of place where kids swarm the streets in costumes, their laughter filling the air. Parents linger at the end of driveways, chatting and sipping coffee from travel mugs. It's usually safe and lively, the perfect small-town suburbia. Around 9:30 p.m., the crowd thinned out. The younger kids had gone home, and only the occasional group of teenagers came by. I was starting to pack up my decorations when I noticed a figure standing at the end of my driveway, just outside the halo of the streetlight. It wasn't unusual for older kids to trick or treat late, but this person was just standing there, not moving, not calling out for candy. They wore a tattered, old-fashioned costume, a dusty brown coat, wide-brimmed hat, and a mask that looked handmade, like a papier-mâché face frozen in a sad expression. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice light. "Want some candy before I close up?" No response. They tilted their head, almost like they were studying me. The chill ran down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, probably just some teenager messing around, but the way they they stood, completely still except for the slight tilt of their head, was unnerving. Okay, well, happy Halloween, I said, a little more forcefully this time, hoping they'd move on. But they didn't. Instead, they took a step closer, their footfall heavy enough to echo in the quiet night. I backed up to my door, keeping my eyes on them. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. They didn't move like a teenager pulling a prank. Their steps were deliberate, slow, almost menacing. I slipped inside and locked the door, peeking out through the window. They were still there, now standing in the middle of my driveway, staring at the house. I turned off the porch light, hoping they'd get bored and leave. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze. This sound wasn't coming from the front door but from the side of the house. My blood turned to ice. How could they have gotten there so fast? I crept to the side window, heart pounding. The figure was there, standing in the shadows. They raised their hand and tapped on the glass with something metal, a long, thin object, maybe a blade. The papier-mâché mask grinned at me now, the sad expression replaced with a grotesque, toothy smile that hadn't been there before. I backed away, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. As I explained what was happening, the operator asked me to stay on the line. I couldn't hear her over the sudden pounding on my front door. I screamed, "They're trying to get in." I ran to the back of the house, locking myself in the bathroom. I could hear heavy footsteps now, circling the house, thudding against windows and doors. Then, silence. I stayed in the bathroom until the police arrived, trembling and clutching a pair of scissors. When they searched the property, they found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. It was like the stranger had vanished into thin air. The only clue they left behind was the mask, propped neatly on my porch. A single line was scrawled inside in shaky, black letters, "Sit next to her." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak in the house, every rustle of wind against the windows felt like a prelude to the stranger's return. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone and staring at the mask the police left behind as evidence. They assured me it was probably a Halloween prank gone too far, maybe a drunk teenager. But something about the precision, the unnatural way they moved and disappeared, didn't feel human. The next morning, I installed new locks and a security system, cameras, motion detectors, the works. My house turned into a fortress. Over the next few days, I obsessed over the footage, hoping for some clue. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone approaching the house or leaving the mask. A week passed, then two. I started to convince myself it really had been a Halloween prank. A weird, creepy one, but harmless in the end. I went back to my routine, though I never quite felt at ease. I avoided looking out windows at night, and my porch light stayed off long after Halloween decorations had come down around the neighborhood. And then, just as I was starting to forget, the knocking came again. It was late, well past midnight, and it wasn't coming from the front door this time. It was at my bedroom window. A steady, deliberate tap. I froze, too terrified to move. My bedroom is on the second floor. Gathering every ounce of courage, I inched toward the window and peeked through the blinds. My stomach dropped. The mask was there, pressed against the glass, staring straight at me. But this time, it wasn't a Loey. Behind the mask was a face, or at least what looked like one. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched over angular bones. Its eyes were wide, bulging, and impossibly dark. A thin, unnaturally long hand reached up and tapped the glass again, its fingers curling as if beckoning me closer. I stumbled backward, my phone slipping from my hand. I heard it laugh, a low, raspy sound that didn't belong to anything human. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where? It was outside my window, and I was trapped. The tapping stopped abruptly. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. As I spoke, I heard footsteps inside the house. The operator stayed on the line as I locked myself in the bathroom again, trying not to hyperventilate. The footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and they were getting closer. I thought I was going to die. Then, just as quickly as they started, they stopped. When the police arrived, they found nothing again, no sign of a break-in, no intruder, no mask at the window. I begged them to check the security footage, desperate for proof I wasn't losing my mind. They reviewed it, and that's when I saw their faces turn pale. The cameras had captured the mask, but not just at the window. It was everywhere. One moment, it was on the porch, the next, in my backyard, then, somehow, at the top of my staircase. The final clip showed it staring directly into the camera, tilting its head in that same slow, deliberate way, and then the footage cut out. The police told me to stay somewhere else for the night. I packed a bag and went to my sister's house, but I didn't tell her everything. How could I? I didn't even understand what was happening myself. That was 2 months ago. I've since sold the house and moved to a new city, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every Halloween, I dread the nightfall. I keep my lights off, my windows covered, and my phone within arm's reach. Movie didn't ease my mind as much as I hoped it would. At first, the new city felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life without the shadow of that night looming over me. But paranoia isn't something you can leave behind like furniture. It follows you, creeping in during the quiet moments. I started avoiding Halloween altogether. No decorations, no candy, no acknowledgement of the day. If anyone asked why, I'd brush it off off with a vague excuse about not being into the holiday. People seemed to accept it, though I catch some neighbors giving me funny looks when they saw my darkened porch surrounded by brightly lit houses. The first Halloween in my new place passed uneventfully, and for a while, I started to relax. The tappy didn't come back, and the cameras I had installed around my new house never caught anything unusual. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I'd escaped. But then the letter arrived. It was mid-October the following year, just as the stores started putting up their Halloween displays. I found it in my mailbox, tucked between some junk mail and a utility bill. It was a plain, white envelope with no return address. My name was written on the front in a shaky, uneven hand. I stood there on my porch, staring at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, like it had been aged artificially. The message was short, written in the same jagged handwriting. "You moved. I found you." My blood ran cold. I immediately checked the security footage from the cameras, scanning the recordings for any sign of someone near my house. Nothing. Whoever left the letter was careful to stay out of sight. I wanted to call the police, but what could I tell them? That someone sent me a creepy letter. They wouldn't take it seriously, not without proof of a real threat. So I threw the letter away and tried to convince myself it was a prank. But the feeling of being watched returned. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes on me. Every shadow felt deeper, every sound more menacing. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my doorbell ringing. It was 3 a.m. My heart was pounding as I checked the camera feed on my phone. The screen showed nothing, just the empty porch bathed in the faint glow of the porch light. The doorbell rang again. This time, I caught movement at the edge of the frame. Something darted out of view, too fast for me to see clearly. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching my phone as the ringing turned into a slow, deliberate knocking. Knock. It was rhythmic, almost mocking. I couldn't bring myself to look again. I stayed in bed, trembling, until the sound stopped. In the morning, I found another letter on my porch. This one wasn't in an envelope. The paper was damp, as if it had been left out in the dew for hours. The message was just one word: soon. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept every light in the house on and sat by the front window with a kitchen knife, staring into the dark. My phone buzzed with a notification from the security app just after midnight. Motion detected, and my hand shook as I opened the app. The camera feed showed my backyard, where the figure stood again. The same costume, the same grotesque mask. They tilted their head, looking directly into the camera, and raised a hand. This time, they waved. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. The police don't believe me. They keep telling me it's a prank, some neighbor trying to scare me. But it's not. This thing, whatever it is, it's not human. It knows where I live. It knows I'm alone, and it's not going to stop. I'm leaving again tomorrow, packing up what I can and driving as far as possible. I don't know if it'll help, but I have to try. To the Halloween stranger, if you're reading this, please, let's not meet ever again. I volunteer at a small, understaffed animal shelter in a quiet town. Most of my shifts are during the day, but once a month, I cover the overnight shift for emergencies. It's not a big deal, just a few animals needing overnight care and the occasional oddball who shows up late to drop off a stray or ask about adoption. A few weeks ago, I had one of those overnight shifts. The shelter itself is small, just a front office, a few kennels, and a tiny break room with a cot for naps. Most of the night was uneventful. I fed the animals, walked the dogs in the enclosed yard, and even dozed off for a bit. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was one of the dogs, but it wasn't coming from the kennel area. It sounded like it was coming from the front office. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight, my heart pounding as I crept toward the noise. The front office is connected to a glass door that looks out onto the parking lot. As I approached, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A man was crouched by the door, scratching at the glass with his nails. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and he was muttering something I couldn't hear through the door. "Sir," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The shelter is closed. If you need help, come back during business hours." He didn't respond. Instead, he pressed his face to the glass, smearing it with something dark. I thought it was dirt at first, but when I shone my flashlight on him, I realized it was blood. I froze, unsure of what to do. He didn't seem aggressive, just frog. His movements were jerky, like he was being controlled by invisible strings. I decided to call the police. As I backed away to grab my phone, the scratching stopped. I turned back, and he was gone. The parking lot was empty, but the smeared blood on the glass proved I hadn't imagined it. The police arrived quickly and searched the area, but didn't find anyone. They reassured me that it was probably just a disturbed person passing through, but they offered to keep a patrol car nearby for the rest of the night. I thanked them and tried to focus on my work, though my nerves were shot. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again, scratching. This time, it was coming from the kennel area. I rushed back there, and all the animals were on edge. The dogs were growling and barking, and even the cats were hissing and puffed up, but there was no one there, just rows of empty cages and frightened animals. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the cages, which had been locked earlier, was wide open. The dog that had been inside, a sweet, elderly lab named Daisy, was gone. I searched everywhere for her but found no sign of her. When the morning staff arrived, I told them everything. They tried to reassure me, saying Daisy might have escaped during the commotion, but I could see the unease in their faces. A few days later, they found her. Daisy's body was in a wooded area a few miles from the shelter. She was mangled, almost like she'd been attacked by something or someone. After I quit the shelter, I tried to put it all behind me, but the memory of that night clung to me, creeping into my thoughts at the worst times, like when I let my own dog out at night and hear the faint sound of scratching in the wind, or when I passed a wooded area on my way to work. A couple of weeks later, I received a call from Sarah, one of the shelter managers. She apologized for reaching out, knowing I had left, but she sounded rattled. Weird things have been happening, she said hesitantly. You're not the only one who's had incidents. I didn't want to hear more, but my curiosity got the better of me. She explained that since I left, the animals have been behaving strangely, whining, refusing to eat, or clawing at their cages as if trying to escape. Worse, staff members have reported hearing strange noises at night, even on evening shifts when there was still plenty of activity. The other night, I stayed late to check on the animals, Sarah admitted, her voice shaking. I saw something, too. A man, or what I thought was a man. He was standing in the yard behind the kennels. I went out to confront him, but he disappeared. There wasn't even a footprint left in the mud. She paused, and then I found one of the dogs. Her voice broke. It was just like Daisy. I felt sick. Whatever was happening wasn't over, and it sounded like it was escalating. I wanted to tell her to shut the shelter down, to stop exposing herself and the animals to whatever this thing was, but I didn't. She sounded like she was already thinking the same thing. After that, I started noticing odd things around my own house. At first, it was little stuff, my dog barking at the back door in the middle of the night, even though the yard was empty. Once, I found scratches on the inside of my front door. I chalked it up to my dog until I realized the scratches were too high up, like someone had been trying to claw their way in. Then I started hearing the noise, the scratching, always faint, always at night. It wasn't just at my door, sometimes it seemed to come from the windows or even the walls. I tried telling myself it was just tree branches or a stray animal, but deep down, I knew better. The final straw came 2 nights ago. I woke up to my dog barking furiously at the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. As I approached the door, I froze. There, pressed against the glass, was a handprint smeared in blood. It was fresh, dripping onto the floor. I didn't hesitate. I called the police and barricaded myself in my bedroom with my dog. The officers arrived quickly, but they didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably a prank or someone trying to scare me. They said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood. But here's the thing, I live in a house with a locked gate. No one should have been able to get into my yard, let alone leave a bloody handprint on my door. I don't know what's happening, but I've started sleeping with all the lights on. My dog won't leave my side, and I'm constantly on edge, jumping at every noise. Last night, something happened that made me question whether I can stay in this house, or anywhere, for that matter. I was lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, trying to distract myself from the uneasy silence that seemed to develop the whole house. My dog, Max, lay curled at my feet, but his ears were perked, and his eyes darted toward the door every so often. He was just as on edge as I was. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was coming from the ceiling. I froze, my heart racing. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be something explainable, like a raccoon or a bird that had somehow gotten into the attic. But then I remembered, I don't have an attic. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving across the ceiling like it was trying to find a way in. Max began to growl, low and deep in his throat, and his fur stood on end. I didn't dare move, and then it stopped. Just silence. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. That's when I heard the faintest whisper. It wasn't coming from the ceiling anymore. It was coming from the bed in the corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling. It was a low, guttural murmur, like a voice that didn't belong to any human. Max started barking furiously, facing the vent, his teeth bared. I wanted to grab him and run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the vent cover popped off and clattered to the floor. Max lunged forward, barking wildly, but there was nothing there. The whispering had stopped, and the silence felt deafening. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher tried to keep me calm as I locked myself and Max in the bathroom, clutching a heavy flashlight as my only weapon. The police arrived within minutes and searched the house top to bottom. They found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing in the vent. I know what I heard. I knew what Max saw. The officers tried to reassure me, but I could tell they thought I was losing it. Before they left, one of them pulled me aside and suggested I might want to consider staying with a friend or family member for a while. I think he could see the fear in my eyes. Today, day, I started packing. I don't know where I'll go, but I can't stay here. Whatever this thing is, it isn't just following me, it's getting bolder. I'm scared it won't stop until it gets what it wants. I've started doing some research into the shelter's history, hoping to find some kind of explanation. But so far, I've come up empty. I can't shake the feeling that whatever is happening started there, and I can't help but feel responsible for the animals and people who are still there. To the man, or the thing, I don't know what you're or why you've chosen me, but please, for both of our sakes, let's not meet again. This happened about 10 years ago when I was 19. I had just started my first real job, working as a night shift cleaner at a large theme park. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I loved the idea of wandering around a deserted park after hours. There was something eerie yet peaceful about it. My job was simple: clean the main attractions after the park closed. That night, I was assigned to the old pirate-themed water ride. It was one of the park's oldest attractions, and while it was a favorite for visitors, employees joked about how creepy it got after dark. Stories of odd noises, shadows moving in the water, and the feeling of being watched were common among my coworkers. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, so I brushed it off as workplace gossip. The ride was built like a giant indoor lagoon with fake shipwrecks, animatronic pirates, and dim lighting meant to replicate moonlight. As I stepped inside, the faint smell of chlorine and mildew hit me. The place was silent, except for the occasional drip of water echoing in the cavernous room. I had a checklist to follow: pick up trash, clean the ride seats, and sweep the walkways. About an hour into my shift, I heard a soft splash. My heart jumped, but I quickly told myself it was probably one of the animatronic figures malfunctioning. That happened all the time, but as I walked toward the sound, I noticed something odd. One of the ride boats, which should have been stationary at the dock, was floating slowly down the water track. I froze, staring at it. It wasn't a current. The water in the ride was still. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing. No answer. I thought maybe another employee was playing a prank, so I walked alongside the track, trying to see if anyone was hiding in the boat. It was empty. Feeling uneasy, I used a long pole to guide the boat back to the dock and secured it with a chain. I tried to shake it off and continued cleaning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. At one point, I heard soft footsteps behind me. When I spun around, there was no one there, just rows of empty seats and plastic pirate mannequins grinning their lifeless smiles. I was almost done when I heard it again, the splash. This time, it was louder. I turned toward the sound and saw that the boat was floating down the track again, but this time it wasn't empty. There was a figure in the back seat. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the silhouette of a person sitting perfectly still, their head tilted slightly as if they were watching me. My blood ran cold. "Hey," I shouted, trying to sound brave. "The park's closed. You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't respond. They didn't move at all. I backed up, reaching for my radio to call security, but before I could, the boat rounded a corner and disappeared into the darkness of the ride's tunnel. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run out of there and never come back, but I couldn't just leave someone in the ride. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and followed the boat. The tunnel was pitch black except for the weak beam of my flashlight. The air was damp and smelled worse than before, like stagnant water. I could hear the faint creak of the boat further ahead but couldn't see it. "Sir, you need to come out now." My voice echoed unnaturally in the narrow space. Still no response. I turned a corner and my flashlight flickered just for a second. That's when I saw it. The boat was stopped in the middle of the track. The figure was gone, but in the water beside it, I saw ripples like someone had just slipped under the surface. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I heard the soft, deliberate sound of wet footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just ran. I ran so fast I nearly slipped on the damp floor, my heart pounding like it would burst out of my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside the ride, gasping for air. I radioed security and told them someone was inside the attraction. They searched the entire ride and found nothing. No boats out of place, no signs of anyone being there. When I told them what I saw, they exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say much. I quit a week later. For weeks after I quit, I couldn't get that night out of my head. I kept replaying the events, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a prank, some overzealous thrill seeker who snuck into the park. But every time I tried to rationalize it, I was left with more questions than answers. Why didn't security find anyone? How did the boat unchain itself twice? And most of all, who or what was in that water? I decided decided to do some digging. I reached out to a former coworker who had been at the park for years. We'll call her Maria. She wasn't surprised when I told her why I left, and her reaction made me uneasy. "Let me guess," she said. "You were on the pirate ride?" "Yeah," I replied. "How did you know?" She gave me a nervous laugh. "It's always the pirate ride. Everyone who works here long enough has a story about that place." She went on to tell me about the ride's history. Apparently, it had a reputation even before I started working there. Employees reported strange occurrences, tools going missing, lights flickering, and the occasional passenger on the ride after hours. Some of the older staff believed the ride was haunted, but Maria thought it was something darker. "Did anyone ever tell you about the accident?" she asked. I hadn't heard anything, so she filled me in. Decades ago, during the ride's construction, a worker drowned in the lagoon. He had been repairing one of the underwater mechanisms when something went wrong, and he got tangled in the machinery. The official story was that it was a tragic accident, but rumors swirled that the park cut corners on safety and tried to cover it up. Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. "They never recovered his body." That was enough to give me chills, but Maria wasn't finished. "Some say he's still down there, stuck in the ride. Other people think it's just something that took his place. Whatever it is, it doesn't like people poking around after dark." I wanted to believe it was just an urban legend, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw that night was connected. I asked Maria if she'd ever experienced anything weird on the ride, and her face turned pale. Once, she admitted, "I was locking up after a late shift, and I swear I saw someone standing in the water. Just standing there. When I turned back, they were gone." That was the last time I spoke to Maria. She left the park not long after, and I don't blame her. The park still operates, and as far as I know, the pirate ride is still a main attraction. Sometimes, I'll see ads for it on TV or hear kids talking about their visit, and it sends a shiver down my spine. I'll never go back there. Not for a visit, not for a job, not for anything. After my conversation with Maria, I did my best to move on. I avoided anything that reminded me of the theme park, commercials, photos, even casual mentions from friends. But some things are harder to leave behind than others. I started having vivid nightmares about the ride. In the dreams, I was always back in the dark tunnel, chasing the drifting boat. The water was deeper, though, up to my chest and freezing cold. I could hear something moving in the water, circling me, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. Then, without fail, the dream would end with me turning around and seeing that figure standing in the water. Its face was always obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing and hungry. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The worst part wasn't the dreams, though. It was the sense that whatever had been in that ride hadn't stayed behind. It felt like it had followed me. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone standing there. At night, I'd hear faint splashing sounds outside my bedroom window, even though there was no water anywhere nearby. Once, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor in my apartment. I lived alone. I tried to rationalize it as stress, residual anxiety from the experience. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't in my head. Something was wrong. One night, about 3 months after I quit, I got a call from an unknown number. I wouldn't normally answer, but something compelled me to pick up. A man's voice, calm but cold, spoke on the other end. "Stay away from the water," he said. Then the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, my heart racing. Who would say something like that? Was it a prank? Or was it a warning? I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. I'd even asked Maria if she'd ever heard of anything like this happening to former employees. She hadn't, but she seemed genuinely scared for me. "Whatever you do," she said, "don't go back to the park. Don't even think about it." I wish I could say I took her advice, but the nightmares, the paranoia, it was driving me insane. I needed closure. I needed answers. A few weeks later, I made a terrible decision. I went back. The park was closed for renovations at the time, so I snuck in late one night. I told myself I was just going to take a quick look around the pirate ride, maybe prove to myself that it was all in my head. But the second I stepped inside the building, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the faint smell of mildew hit me like a wall. The ride was eerily silent, even more so than I remembered. The water was still, reflecting the dim emergency lights like a black mirror. I walked along the track, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Everything looked the same as it had the night I quit, except for one thing, the boat. It was already floating in the water, bobbing gently as if it were waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like I was being pulled forward toward the boat. Before I knew it, I was stepping into it, sitting down in the front seat. The moment I did, the boat started moving. I didn't scream. I didn't call out. I just sat there, frozen, as the boat carried me through the ride. The animatronics were still, their eyes lifeless, their painted smiles mocking me. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and the sound of the water lapping against the boat grew louder, almost deafening. Then we entered the tunnel. It was darker than I remembered, the air damp and suffocating. I could hear something moving in the water, keeping pace with the boat boat. I gripped the edge of the seat, my knuckles white, and forced myself to look. That's when I saw it. The figure was there, rising slowly from the water, its face shrouded in darkness. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, emerging from the depths, their pale, bloated faces contorted in silent screams. They surrounded the boat, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking and full of malice. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside the ride, gasping for air and trembling uncontrollably. My clothes were soaked, and my phone was gone. I ran out of the park and didn't stop until I reached my car. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. The nightmares have stopped, but I still hear the occasional splash or faint footsteps at night. Maybe it's my imagination, or maybe it's something worse. To anyone reading this, if you ever find yourself at a theme park late at night, do yourself a favor, stay far away from the pirate ride, into whatever I saw in that tunnel, to the thing that followed me home. This happened about a year ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I had just moved to a small, quiet town for work. It was one of those places that feels frozen in time. Lots of old shops and abandoned buildings that no one bothers to tear down. One of the more prominent landmarks was an old carnival ground just outside town. The carnival had been shut down for decades, but the locals still talk about it. Some said it closed after a bad accident. Others whispered about darker things, like disappearances. I chalk it up to small town gossip. One evening, I decided to check it out. I'd always been fascinated by abandoned places, and I thought it would make for some cool photos. Armed with my phone and flashlight, I headed out just before sunset. When I got there, the place was eerily quiet. Rusted rides loomed like skeletons in the fading light, and tattered banners flapped weakly in the breeze. The smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. I wandered through the grounds, snapping pictures of the derelict Ferris wheel and the crumbling funhouse. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a mannequin, a leftover prop from one of the attractions. He was sitting in one of the bumper cars, slouched forward like he'd been there forever. His clothes were filthy and tattered, blending into the grime of the car. But then, as I moved closer, he turned his head. It was a slow, deliberate motion, like he was trying to make sure I noticed. "Ted," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place is off limits, you know." He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head to the side, like a curious dog. Something about the way he moved was rugged, too smooth, too deliberate. I backed away, my heart pounding. My flashlight beam wavered as I tried to focus it on him, but it barely seemed to touch him. It was like the shadows around him were alive, swallowing the light. Then he stood up. He was tall, much taller than I'd expected, and his limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally as he unfolded himself from the car. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the empty space. I turned and ran. The carnival felt like a maze in the dark. Rides and stalls loomed out of the shadows, and I kept tripping over debris. I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady and relentless, no matter how fast I ran. Finally, I burst out onto the main road, gasping for air. When I looked back, the entrance to the carnival was dark and empty, no sign of him. I told a coworker about it the next day, and they went pale. "You went there?" they asked, their voice trembling. "Nobody goes to the old carnival. People who do don't always come back." I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. A couple of weeks passed, and I did my best to forget about the carnival. I threw myself into work and avoided talking about it. The nightmares were fewer and farther between, and I started convincing myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe it was some drifter who liked squatting there. Maybe the shadows had just played tricks on me. But then, things started happening. It began with the photos I had taken that night. I hadn't dared to look at them until I felt a little braver, but when I finally opened the gallery on my phone, my stomach dropped. Every picture from the carnival was corrupted. At first, I thought it was a glitch, static and streaks of light smearing across the images. But as I flipped through them, I noticed shapes, faces. They weren't clear, but they were there, twisted, grotesque faces staring back at me from the shadows of the rides. I deleted them all. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to listen. The sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from inside the house, but from outside, on the street. I peered through the blinds, my breath caught in my throat. The street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of a flickering street lamp. But then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the light. It was him, the man from the carnival. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his head tilted in that same unnatural way. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. He was watching my house. I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The next morning, I told myself it had to be a dream. I wanted to believe it, but as I left for work, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the sidewalk, just outside my house, was a single dusty footprint. I tried to stay calm, to go about my day like nothing was wrong. But that night, he came back. This time, he was closer. I could see him standing on my front top lawn, his head still tilted, his arms hanging limply at his sides. I didn't sleep that night. I started seeing him everywhere, in my rearview mirror while driving, reflected in store windows, always at a distance, always watching. Every time, he was a little closer. Desperate, I went back to my coworker, the one who had warned me about the carnival. I told them everything, hoping they'd have some kind of answer. They listened in silence, their face growing paler with every word. When I finished, they leaned in close and whispered, "You shouldn't have gone there. They don't like to be disturbed." They, I asked, my voice shaking. They repeated, "The ones who never left." I didn't stick around to ask what they meant. That night, I packed a bag and drove as far away from that town as I could. I never told anyone where I was going, and I've been careful not to look back. But sometimes, I still feel like I'm being watched. The other day, I found a dusty footprint outside my new apartment. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. Maybe the footprint was from a passing delivery person or some kid cutting through the complex. But deep down, I knew better. I hadn't seen him since I left that town, but the feeling of being watched had never entirely gone away. The next few weeks were uneventful, or so I thought. I tried to settle into my new life, keeping my head down and avoiding anything that might stir up trouble. But the signs started creeping back in. One night, as I was coming home from work, I found my front door slightly ajar. I froze on the spot, my pulse racing. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. Cautiously, I stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but as I moved through the apartment, I noticed a strange smell, like damp earth and old wood. It was faint but unmistakable. Then I saw it. On my kitchen counter, in the middle of the otherwise spotless surface, was a small, rusted token. It looked like one of those old carnival tokens, with faded lettering and an unreadable design stamped into the metal. I didn't touch it. Instead, I packed a bag, left the apartment, and checked into a hotel. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, but when I returned the next day, the token was gone. That's when I started hearing the music. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the hum of my apartment. It sounded like an old carnival organ playing a warped and disjointed melody. It only ever came at night, and it always seemed to be just out of reach, coming from the next room, or the hallway, or even the street outside. I called the building manager, thinking maybe it was a neighbor playing music, but they looked at me like I was crazy. The apartments around mine were vacant. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The music was louder than ever, and it felt like it was coming from inside my bedroom. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam around the room, desperate to find the source. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the corner, half shrouded in shadow. His body seemed taller than before, his limbs impossibly long and thin. His face was obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me. I froze, my hand shaking so badly that the flashlight beam danced erratically across the walls. The music grew louder, a cacophony of distorted notes that made my head throb. Then he moved, not toward me, but closer to the wall. His hand reached out, impossibly long fingers brushing the plaster, and then he disappeared. He didn't walk away or fade into the shadows. He just vanished, as though he'd stepped through the wall itself. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night, either. I was too afraid to close my eyes, too afraid to even turn off the lights. The music didn't come back, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The next day, I decided to leave. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far from there. But as I packed my things, I found something in my suitcase that made my stomach drop. It was the carnival token, polished and gleaming as though it had just been made. This time, there was no mistaking the inscription. It read, "Admit once." When I was 15, my younger brother, Josh, begged me to take him to the park one evening. It wasn't far from our house, and we'd gone there countless times during the day, but tonight was different. The park was deserted, and the playground, usually bursting with kids, was eerily still. Josh was obsessed with the new jungle gym. It was massive, with tunnels, slides, and rope bridges. He dashed toward it, leaving me to sit on one of the benches. I scrolled through my phone while keeping an eye on him. The faint squeak of the swings and the rustle of the wind were the only sounds. About 10 minutes in, I heard Josh laughing, not his usual laugh, though it sounded off like he was trying too hard. I looked up and saw him perched at the top of the jungle gym, staring down at one of the slides. "Josh, what's so funny?" I called. "There's a man down there," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. I froze. The playground was empty when we arrived. "What do you mean?" "He's funny. He keeps poking his head out and then hiding again," Josh giggled, pointing toward the covered spiral slide. I couldn't see anything from where I was sitting. "Come down here now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But he's playing hide and seek," Josh protested. I marched toward the jungle gym, my heart pounding. When I got closer, I peered into the slide but saw nothing. "Josh, there's no one here. Come down." Josh hesitated, his smile fading. "He was just here," he whispered. "Now," I said firmly. Reluctantly, he climbed down, and we started walking home. The streetlights cast long shadows on the empty road, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Halfway back, Josh stopped abruptly. "Why is he still following us?" he asked, pointing to the shadows cast by the streetlights. I turned, expecting to see someone. There was nothing. Nobody. Just the two of us. "Josh, there's no one there," I said, grabbing his hand. "Yes, there is," he insisted, pulling away. "He's walking funny like this." He mimicked a jerky, swaying motion that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to see what he was talking about. I grabbed his arm and sprinted the rest of the way home. When we got inside, I locked the door and checked all the windows. My parents were out for the evening, so it was just us. Josh seemed fine, even cheerful. He went straight to his room while I stayed in the living room, trying to calm down. A couple of hours later, I heard a knock at the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. It was almost midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? I peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. The porch light flickered, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Then, from Josh's room, I heard him laughing again, the same forced, unnatural laugh from the playground. I rushed to his room and threw the door open. He was sitting on his bed, staring at the corner. "He's back," he said, pointing. The corner was empty, but as I stepped closer, the shadows seemed to shift, like something was hiding just out of sight. I grabbed Josh and bolted out of the house. He waited on the porch until my parents came home, but I didn't tell them what happened. How could I? They'd never believe me. Josh stopped talking about the man after that night, but he refused to go back to the park. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home. At first, it was subtle, the occasional flicker of a light, the feeling of being watched when no one else was around. But as the days passed, it got worse. One night, about a week after the incident, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, moving back and forth outside my door. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was one of my parents checking on us. But when I glanced at the clock, it was 3:17 a.m. too late for that. "Nope," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. My bedroom door creaked open just an inch, as if someone was testing it. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Then, from Josh's room, I heard that laugh again. It was muffled, like he was trying to keep it quiet, but it was unmistakable. I bolted out of bed and ran to his room. He was sitting up, staring at his open closet. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "He's in there," Josh whispered, pointing at the darkened closet. I flipped on the light, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, but it was empty. Just clothes, shoes, and a couple of old toys. I walked over and pushed the clothes aside, checking every inch of the small space. "Nothing, Josh, there's no one here," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice wavered. "He's hiding," Josh insisted. "He only shows up when the lights are off." My stomach dropped. I turned to him, trying to think of something reassuring to say, but before I could, the light in the room flickered. Once, twice, then it went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and Josh let out a scream. I grabbed him, pulling him close, as a sound filled the room, a raspy, wheezing noise, like someone struggling to breathe. It was coming from the closet. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. The closet door was swinging slightly, even though there was no draft. The wheezing sound stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. And then, from behind me, I heard a whisper. "Found you." I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. Nothing, but Josh was shaking, clutching me tightly, tears streaming down his face. "He's here," he sobbed. "He's here." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, holding Josh, my eyes fixed on the closet. By morning, the room looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. That day, I told my parents everything. At first, they thought I was imagining things, but when they saw how terrified Josh was, they started to believe something was wrong. My dad called a family friend who was a pastor, and he came over to bless the house. For a while, things seemed to settle down, but every now and then, I still feel it, the cold air, the flickering lights, the sense that someone is watching. Josh won't sleep in his room anymore, and I can't blame him. We never went back to the park, and I avoid driving past it when I can. Life returned to a strange sort of normal after the pastor blessed the house. The heavy feeling that had hung over everything seemed to dissipate, and for a while, I let myself believe it was over. Josh started sleeping in the guest room, and I stopped hearing his unsettling laughter in the middle of the night, but I could tell he still wasn't okay. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and he refused to be alone, even during the day. Every shadow, every creak of the house made him jump. One evening, a few weeks after the blessing, I was cleaning up the living room while my parents were out, and Josh was sitting on the couch, coloring. The TV was on in the background, and everything felt dormant until it didn't. It started with a low humming sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the TV, but when I turned it off, the sound persisted. It wasn't coming from any device, it was coming from the hallway, the same hallway where I'd heard the footsteps that night. Josh stopped coloring. He stared at the doorway, his hand frozen mid-stroke. Do you hear that? He whispered. I nodded, my heart racing. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Josh dropped his crayon and clutched my arm. He's back, he said, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, the lights flickered, not just in the living room, throughout the whole house. The hum returned, now joined by faint whispers, too soft to make out the words. The whispers were coming closer, louder, filling the room. And then the TV turned back on, even though I'd unplugged it. Static filled the screen, and amidst the crackling noise, I saw it, a figure, pale, with long, distorted limbs, crouched in the static like it was trying to push through the screen. Its head jerked unnaturally, tilting back and forth as if it was studying us. Josh screamed, and the figure snapped its head toward him. It raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers pressing against the glass. Then it spoke. Why did you leave me? The voice was deep, guttural, and filled with a strange kind of sorrow. The lights flickered violently, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. I grabbed Josh and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. Behind us, the static grew louder. I turned to see the figure now pressing its face against the screen, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, as if it was screaming silently. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and then everything went black. I woke up on the living room floor, with Josh curled up beside me. The house was quiet, and the lights were back to normal. The TV was off, the cord still lying on the ground where I'd unplugged it. For a moment, I thought it had been a dream, until I saw the scratches. 4 long, jagged scratches ran across the living room wall, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Josh wouldn't talk about what happened, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't mean to say anything. I knew he'd said it too. We moved out of that house a month later. My parents thought it was just because we needed a change, that the new house would help Josh and me move past whatever had scared us so badly. But it didn't matter where we went. The thing followed us. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.